All right, I guess we're live. I wonder how long we were live before we knew we were live. Anyway, hi everybody, I'm Aaron Saltzman. I'm here with Paige Beckman, who's a corporate lawyer and a person who has a lot of expertise in data protection and personal privacy. We're doing a Facebook Live here in the CBC auditorium, or the CBC atrium. Obviously, your expertise is the reason why we're doing this today, because the news this week has been of so much interest to so many people. Let's start with, first of all, your background. What can you tell me about your experience with data protection and data privacy? Most people, you know, when we talk about this subject, we tend to talk to cyber experts, we tend to talk to, you know, the companies involved or the privacy commissioner. It's not often we have a lawyer who's an expert in this area.
Sure.
So what's your involvement with this?
Sure, so I co-chair our firm's Global Privacy and Data Security Group. So we deal with data security, data breaches, domestically and internationally quite a bit. I'm also a chair of a cyber safety foundation, so I will advocate on both sides of issues to ensure that we get to the right place from a legal perspective.
Okay, really interesting. Of course, we're talking about this week because of the news this week that there were two related security breaches at two Canadian banks, Simply Financial and the Bank of Montreal. Maybe we should start with a little background on that story for those of you who haven't followed that story. The banks got the word about this, they told us, on Sunday that their systems had been breached. 40,000 customers at Simply Financial had their records accessed, and 50,000, or at least we believe it's fewer than 50,000 at BMO. The interesting parts about this are there are so many different aspects to this story. The first one was that the hackers themselves notified the banks that they did this. Now, you've followed these kinds of things before, so what struck you about that?
There's a lot of things that I find very interesting about this particular breach, threefold. One, the hack was for what we would call a traditional purpose, to steal money or to take money. So we've seen money being transferred from the hacked account. So that was traditional. What we didn't expect was the communication to the banks, the ransom that they're demanding for a payment of about $1 million, and then the posting of the full profiles of the bank account owners online. So my understanding is that there's about 100 bank account owners whose profile, including name, social insurance number, bank account, home address, has all been posted online.
I have the list right here in my phone.
Right. So it's an interesting sort of trifecta on this one, and I think it's really taking the banking industry, it's waking them up a little bit. Typically, banking industry is at the forefront of cybersecurity for good reasons, very practical reasons. The share value is tied to it. So this one is really waking, I think, the banking and the financial industry up. So this one's an interesting one to watch.
Exactly. All right, we're going to get to your questions in a minute, and I'm sure you have many, many questions. I want to ask just a few questions myself before we get to them, if that's okay, because I'm curious about this. I think the main question that everybody is asking right now is, if I'm a Simply Financial customer or I'm a BMO customer, how worried should I be? How concerned should I be about my data being out there?
Well, if you're one of the ones whose data has been stolen, then you have a valid reason to be very concerned about this. They've stolen not just your traditional credit information, which is relatively easy to manage. They've stolen enough to do a full identity theft, which is, or at least it appears that they've stolen enough to have a full identity theft. And that's where you get really concerned, because that takes a long time to try and manage, and you're never really sure when there's been a full identity theft that you're okay. You're always watching your back. So I think that there's grounds for those individuals to be worried. For those individuals that have not been hacked, whose accounts are secure, I would say that your level of security, you should feel the same level of security as you did on Saturday before this happened, which is you still need to take all appropriate steps to monitor, to ensure that your bank account has not been used for inappropriate purposes. But I will again say that banks are really at the leading edge of cybersecurity. Obviously something went wrong here and they're going to learn from that, but of all institutions, banks are usually at the forefront of this.
And the concern obviously is that this information could be used to create an identity that is not you, but certainly looks like you and appears to be you. And you know, we've seen that happen in the past where victims of identity theft have suddenly found out that somebody holds a mortgage in their name and they're responsible for it. Or somebody is running up the credit card. I guess the credit card is not as big a deal as the mortgage fraud, but my goodness, you can be in a really, really difficult situation because of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So full identity theft can really give access to the person to take over your life and be you. Now, in this instance, the banks know whose account information has been hacked, so they can put appropriate credit security measures in place to watch that individual's accounts. And if something looks unusual, they're probably going to be already on alert on it. So my guess is that there likely won't be anything from a credit perspective or a mortgage that deals with banks that would be a big issue. The other issues, though, that you would find is the information that's been used to buy products, goods, or services in your names and sell it. And then let's say when this dies down in 6 months to a year time, they still have that information. It's still your information. You can't change it. That's when I would say that's where the greatest risks are, as when this dies down and maybe the credit monitoring is no longer in place.
Okay, I have way more questions.
Absolutely.
Many, many more, but I want to get to
on.
the questions from our viewers right now on Facebook, first of all. So we have a few, and the first one is actually a question from YouTube. It's, I'm a Simply account holder, no breach. How can we be certain that the banks have released correct information as opposed to only the info the attackers had? Would they hide additional breaches? Is there a law requiring banks to disclose the entirety of a breach once it's public? That's about 4 questions in one.
Right.
But that touches on a lot of things.
Right.
So maybe, what do you think?
So let's talk through that. So typically when a breach happens, the institutions who have been hacked will inform the individuals whose accounts have been breached, whether it's financial institutions or otherwise. It's not really in their best interest if they know others have been hacked not to release it. Now, having said that, if they may be certain some have been hacked and not quite as certain as others. So what they may do is not release on the ones where they're a little iffy on until they know. Once they know, there's incentive for them to disclose. And it's selfish incentive, but the more that they can disclose up front, the better protection those individuals can take themselves, and the bank can help them so the damages are lower and potential claims against those organizations will be less. So there's a practical incentive for them to get this information in front of individuals as fast as they can so that they can mitigate potential damages.
So this raises a question that I have, which is, why are there no federal regulations in place that would compel banks or any other institution to notify consumers in the event of a breach?
Well, that's a great question. And as of November 1, we are getting federal regulations that will compel organizations to notify breach when there's a reasonable risk of significant harm to individuals. And I would suggest
this is the new bill coming,
it's
yes.
the new, So it's coming into effect November 1, and that will be mandatory breach notification. So far, organizations, though, particularly banks, will still tend to notify the regulators when a breach occurs, and they will.
The Privacy Commissioner, you mean,
the Privacy Commissioner,
or would that be OSFI, or?
They may notify OSFI as well, Privacy Commissioner for sure, and also individuals.
Okay.
There have been guidelines for a long time about notification, whether it hasn't been a law, but there's been guidelines, and in situations like this, we typically see notification being done. Again, selfishly, so that they mitigate their risk. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it helps you as individuals know, and it helps them.
I think it might help some consumers to know that there are some rules in place that would force them to do it, though, too. And which brings up another question, just before we get to these other ones, which is, I've spoken with various people about this legislation that's coming in November, and one of the questions they have and the criticisms they have is that even when this new legislation comes in, it's worded in such a way that, and I can't remember the exact wording, but it's something along the lines of they have a duty to disclose automatically if they feel there's a direct threat or something like that, right?
Generally, it's a reasonable risk.
A reasonable risk of
significant harm.
But that, the critics say, leaves it up to the banks or whatever institution to determine what is a reasonable risk.
Absolutely.
That seems like it's still a bit of a hole.
There is a wiggle room. There is wiggle room in this for sure for organizations to notify or not. And I'm not sure you're going to necessarily get away from that in regulation. There's no hard line, because you have to look at the totality of the information and determine whether there's going to be harm to the individual. If there's been a breach, and let's say that there's been a breach but it's fully encrypted data, there's no risk.
Yeah.
So do you notify? Why would you notify? Because there's also risk of people getting notification fatigue.
Yeah.
The more notification you get about these things, which happen pretty regularly, the less you're going to pay attention to it. So they really wanted to have a threshold where it's, look, there's a serious risk to you. And I think by all accounts, this would far surpass.
This would qualify.
This would qualify.
All right, we're going to go back to our questions here. This is from Jean Elliott on Facebook, who asks, how do we stop it? Now, I don't know if that's necessarily a question for you, but she says she's had 2 breaches before with BMO.
Right.
So what do you suggest on that one? I know you're not a cybersecurity expert, but
right.
You know, we have had some thoughts on this.
So I'm a consumer as well, and
yeah.
I have banking relationships. So I think when you're choosing banks or financial institutions, look at their security. Are they at the front runner of the security? So that's the first thing. Don't just bank with your interest rates. Bank with other factors in mind. Then you personally, there's a lot of things you can do as well. Make sure that your passwords, that you're using different passwords on different sites, because what hackers will do is they'll take a password that they've either figured out or obtained, and then they'll flood it across the net to see if it matches any other accounts that you use. So use different passwords, not even slightly, not just slightly different, but actually different passwords. Don't use public Wi-Fi. Use secure Wi-Fi when you're doing online banking. Those are those are some of the smaller things that we can do. Banks, I think, are obviously looking at. There's a tension there. Banks want the user experience to be easy enough that they'll bank with them, but maybe we're looking at 3-factor authentication. So yes. Currently, most banks use 2-factor authentication for online banking, personal banking. Yeah. Some should be. Maybe we consider third.
Now, when you say 3-factor, Jen, we refer to it as 2-factor because the second factor you're referring to is the password, which is still part of the initial identification, right? So if you want a separate factor of identification, it's got to be separate. It's got to be something that comes to a site or a device that's away from what you're logging into, right? So if we're looking at this, personally, we know that at least one bank has just announced that they are going to 2-factor identification, that being log in with your name and password, but then you would receive a text or a code that is specific to you, time sensitive. It would come to your device, which you have registered. That kind of 2-factor identification is nearly impossible to crack, right? Yeah. When you think about it, they would have to be in possession not only of the login credentials, but also your separate device. That's almost impossible.
And I just logged into my account. Just so I can show you something. So third-factor authentication, as you've mentioned, is usually your name, your username, your password, and then you have a third factor. I've brought in 2 devices here. Each of these have random digits that will show up. Yes. This one will just have a random digit. They're good for 30 seconds. So that's your third factor. You plug it in. This one, which is on my smartphone, I type in a code that I know in my head, and it generates 6 digits, and I have 30 seconds to use this. This is my third-factor identification when I'm logging in remotely to my work address. Yeah. So these are very personal, and they're very, very hard to crack.
Very effective. So I guess,
but it does challenge the user experience. So we will have to be comfortable with that.
So that's the question. I remember when, first of all, we've had 2-factor identification at CBC with our email. We use Gmail for the CBC email, and the first few times you get it, you're like, oh man, where's my phone? Yeah. You know, I have to, it's downstairs, or I got it, it's one extra step, right? The question is, is that sort of inconvenience worth it? Will the consumers decide that is worth it for the protection? Right. I would submit that after a situation like this, a lot would.
Yes, yeah. I agree. I think bang on. Initially, it's irritating, and it's really irritating. But after a while, you get used to it.
You get used to it.
And there is going to be a price to pay. When we're talking about additional security, there's generally a greater price you're going to pay for user friendliness.
So I understand the sort of reticence on behalf of organizations to put that in, because they want it to be, like you said, as smooth an experience as possible. They want it to be as user-friendly as possible. But this raises some other questions about how banks and other organizations protect the information. So in this instance, one of the first questions that was raised, and you touched on it, is encryption or tokenism. Right? Why would this data not have been encrypted? And because in the case of a leak or a malicious attack, well, it doesn't matter if it gets out. It's, again, another thing that's without the key, without the encryption key, almost impossible to crack. You know, I mean, what would be the other thing? You know, with the banks. I mean, why wouldn't they have that in place? I guess is the question.
Well, I can't speak to the security architecture of the banks. But it's a good question, and I'm sure they're looking at this, and I'm sure they're looking at whether or not something like that would have helped in this situation. So for those of you who may not be aware, encryption is like putting a wall around data, and even if you get it, you can't get at it. It's generally seen as fully secure. Tokenization is really the substitution of data, for instance, your 16-digit credit card number with random alphanumeric digits that make no sense to anybody.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure the banks are looking at that. One thing that I will say that, and I always, when I'm giving people advice in this area, is the best thing or the best bang for your buck in terms of where you're spending money is educating employees and educating people who have access to your systems, because the majority of breaches or incursions happen because of a human interface. There's been someone sent an email, a phishing email to you, and you thought it may have been, you know, someone that you trusted, so you respond or you open the link. We need to be better educated about that, and I think we can probably do a lot more education for the $1 million rather than the latest and greatest systems. Hackers will always be one step ahead. Mm-hmm. It's a great tension.
I get that.
Yeah.
I get that. I also am a little reluctant to sort of put the blame on the consumer and I'm not saying that's what you're doing.
No.
But I mean, in this situation, there's nothing the consumer could have done,
absolutely.
right? Because it doesn't matter how powerful your password was, or if it was an individualized password or anything, because for people who don't understand what happened here, these hackers, according to the hackers themselves, and they contacted us directly, the CBC, and told us how they did it, they found a hole. Yep. They found a hole. They used a logarithm that is basically a computer program that would generate numbers, right? So it's 0000000, then 0000001, and they keep doing that at a high speed until they hit a number that's a valid account.
Yes.
Once they hit a number that's a valid account, then they were able to go to the portal, put that in, and say, oh, I've just forgotten my password. Mm-hmm. So they don't have the password at that point, but at that point they're able to say, can I reset my security questions? And the hole was there, where the security questions were able to be reset. Once they're reset, they can get in. Now, there is absolutely nothing that the customers of these banks could have done to protect themselves in this case.
And I'm sure the IT folks at these banks are not sleeping right now.
Yeah, but that just raises the other question for me, and that is, we talked about encryption. I've seen this list. We dug it up. We've got 100 people on it, all BMO customers. I know their names, their ages, their SIN numbers, their home addresses, their dates of birth. I know their air miles numbers. I know that whether they're married or not. I know their citizenship. I know their secondary citizenship. There's 150 data points on each of these individuals here. Why would the banks not, or any other company, should there be rules in place that would separate that information? So say they get in and they get your bank account, but why does all this other stuff have to be kept in the same file?
It's a great question. You're absolutely right, and I'm sure that they're looking at that, because best practices do mandate that you're separating data as much as you can, so that if there's an incursion, the data that's hacked is as limited as possible. It is unbelievable that all of this data was obtained through one hack, and it's incredibly unfortunate that this happened. I'm sure, and I hope this is a wake-up call for everybody to look at where they're storing their data to make sure that it is separated.
We're going to go back to some questions here. This is an interesting one. I'm not sure you should answer it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Should we switch banks, or are all banks equally breachable? What's your take on that? I'm not necessarily suggesting which bank somebody should bank with. I guess the question in a more general sense is there a sense that the banks as a whole have similar security apparatus, or are there different levels within them, do you think?
I think I'll answer that question by saying I really think people should start asking this question when they choose their banks, because not all of the banks are similarly structured, and their security architecture will be different. So you should be asking these questions, and that the point we just talked about, how is your data held? Is it all together, or have you separated it out? Those are good questions that people should be asking. Now, the banks tend to work together on cybersecurity risk assessments and threats. So there will be a general level of security that they probably all share, but there may be deltas, and different banks will operate differently online, whether it's the former ING Direct or Tangerine, basic online banks versus your tried and true, your brick and mortar type banks. They may operate differently with different security.
So I'll try and answer that question myself just a little bit as a consumer reporter. Sure. Again, I would never advocate for one organization over another or say one is better or worse, but I will tell you that I personally received an email from a BMO customer who said that he's not only a BMO customer, he's a TD customer. With TD, he has a password that is 32 characters long. It's randomly generated. It has all kinds of different upper and lower case symbols, all these sorts of things. But his BMO password, he said, was restricted to six alphanumeric characters only. So for people who don't understand what that means it's 6 numbers or letters, not even upper or lower case, and no special symbols. And he was concerned that is somehow less secure. I can't say whether that's somehow less secure, but that seems like a difference between two institutions. We did mention that TD is going to two-factor identification, or as you called it, three-factor. Maybe what you say is the best thing to do is to when you first open an account, or even if you have one, go back. Go back and say,
this is a great time to ask these questions.
Hey, I'm concerned about this. What measures do you have in place to make sure that this doesn't happen to me?
Right.
I don't know whether there's any more you can do. It's really difficult for us to say whether one is better than the other.
I don't think we're in a position to
And again,
know
we shouldn't just say that Simply and BMO are somehow worse than the others, because they're not the only ones who've been hit by this. Right. This is a bad one, and it happened this week, and it might be the most publicized. Right. But we have organizations in this country. We have, Home Depot was hit, Nissan was hit, Uber was hit. These things happen, and the CIA has been hit.
Everybody
right?
is going
Everybody
to be hit.
Gets hit. It's just a matter of time, right?
Absolutely, it's a matter of time, and it's how you respond to it. And we as consumers need to. We have to get our head around that we want the ease of online relationships, online communication, and with that, this is going to happen. And we try to mitigate it. We try to stop it. But when it happens, how do you respond? Exactly.
All right, we have a question from Anto M on Facebook. This is an interesting question. If I don't have a BMO account, but I have a credit card by them, am I at risk at all? Do you know?
Typically, credit cards are slightly different than the bank accounts, so I can't tell you whether they've accessed both or not, but typically they are dealt with by separate
It's a different company, right?
Yeah.
So that's my understanding as well. And having looked at the data, there were no credit card numbers within that. The closest thing that was in the list of data points was an air miles number. And the reason the air miles number was in there is because BMO has a credit card product that is tied to air miles.
Right.
So as far as I know, Anto, if you have just a credit card but not a bank account, then it's probably not a problem. But you may want to contact them anyway. We're not experts in that area.
They're going to have a client center dedicated to this. So please, if you have any concerns, I would just say call them and ask your questions. And call your other banks as well, even if it's not BMO or Simply or CIBC. Now is a great time when this is top of mind to call your banks and ask them how they would prevent this. Why is it that your data is safer than what just happened?
Yes, exactly. Gladys Flat asks, and this is a really interesting question, was just internet banking affected? Before you answer that, or I try to answer that, that, quite frankly, never even occurred to me. I do all of my banking online or on my phone, and everybody I know does that too. It never occurred to me that this would be a question for somebody who didn't have online access. Maybe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have just a brief thought on that, and there really is no difference between online banking and traditional banking. The system, the integrity of the system and the security of the system around the data points are the same. Your access points tend to be different, and that's where your security risk there's the delta, which is the security risk of accessing it online.
Yes.
Whether you are a traditional banker or someone who banks online, the public Wi-Fi is is risky. But let's just say, like, I do both. I walk in and speak to a teller, and I also do online banking.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily feel that one is less safe than the other.
Sure. So in this instance, if I were to try to answer that question, I would say that if you don't do online banking, then you are not at risk. And the reason I would say that, and again, this is just my own personal belief, is in order to do online banking, you don't just have to have your account set up. There is a completely separate process that you have to go through with most institutions that is outside the actual branch setup when you set up your online account. And oftentimes it's a setup that involves a computer or a phone call to security questions. It doesn't happen when you say you've always banked in a branch and you've only ever walked in and you've only ever used the teller. Then you don't have an online login. You just don't have it. You can't just simply log in and put in your card. You won't have a password. You won't have anything set up. If you don't have that, then the hackers, as was described to me in their email to me, would not have been able to access it because they only went through the online portal.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. They wouldn't have had the ability to reset security questions because they wouldn't have been there in the first place.
So I think you're okay there. This is interesting. So we have several Facebook messages about not using internet banking anymore. Is phone or going to the branch safer? You kind of just touched on that. I would think it's a pretty extreme reaction to not bank online after this. I think that's a little, I can understand some of the concerns surrounding it.
I think that's a personal choice. I mean, if you're going to get away from the online banking, you're going to get away from a lot of the convenience and just practical day-to-day life that you enjoy by doing online commerce, whether it's banking or general purchasing online. And that's a particular choice, and some people are willing to give that up. I would say that's a bit of an extreme example.
I think, if it's okay with you, I want to just get back a little bit closer before we go back to the questions from our viewers to what I think might be a little more your purview around the regulations and the privacy situation. Maybe I'll start by asking you one thing that occurred to me. I was having a conversation with one of the hosts of the National, Ian Hannah-Mansing, the other night. When we were doing this story, we were discussing this story. He had a couple of instances where his credit information had been stolen, and he was saying, look, I've got credit monitoring set up. I feel like that's kind of bulletproof, because if somebody tries to open a new credit product in my name or a credit, I get notified and I say that's not me. The banks have been offering free credit monitoring.
Yes.
CBC had a breach recently, and CBC employees were all offered free credit monitoring. How much help is that, do you think?
I think it's a big help. I recommend it whenever there's a breach. One of the things we generally advise, if there's financial data involved, is credit monitoring for a period of time. Whether or not that period of time is long enough is up for debate.
Yeah.
But you're right. It is a notification that if there's a transaction that sort of flags something, that it alerts you and you have better control. Is it bulletproof? Absolutely not. But it is something that I recommend people really look into. I have it as well. I haven't been subject to a breach.
Yeah. And the other thing that we haven't talked about are the regional differences across Canada, because we have rules in place in BC and Alberta, right, where there is mandatory notification.
In Alberta.
Is it Alberta?
Yeah.
Okay, just Alberta. We don't have that necessarily until this new legislation comes in. But in Ontario, new legislation was recently passed in this area. It was kind of weird because they hooked it in with like elevator servicing and stuff like that. Anyway, but within that bill, one of the aspects of that is that you will have the ability to request a freeze on your credit. I don't know how much you know about that, but
no, I haven't looked into
so
that.
that's new legislation that has recently come in. That to me is quite interesting, because if in the past, when I've done more than my share of stories on people who've had their identities stolen. And one of the issues with that is all of a sudden you have to prove who you are. is very difficult. You can't cut things off. You know, you're on the phone with the credit monitoring agencies and you say, hey, no, I'm me, that's not me.
Right.
And you're in a position of having to prove that you are you and that criminal
Right.
is not you.
Right.
And for so long we have said as consumers, well, why can't we just put a freeze on it?
Right.
Now there's
Yeah,
finally
yeah,
legislation.
yeah.
So if you live in Ontario, you've
Right.
got a little bit of,
Right.
of backup there.
And I think that makes sense. I think the ability to just, instead of shutting everything down, putting a hold on something for a period of time, I think makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. All right, I think we've got time for one more question from online. This is from Miguel Roberto Manglagot. Don't they perform these types of tests to ensure they can't be hacked by brute force? That's an interesting question.
Sure. Organizations, particularly banks and anyone dealing with sensitive information, will do what are called penetration tests, which are essentially ethical hacks, which they try to find holes that they can then get access to your data. So I'm sure that I would have great confidence that the banks have done that. I don't know when that would have happened or how often or frequently they do that, but they do it.
Yeah,
Just the hackers are a little better in this instance.
I have all kinds of questions about this myself, just because the technical aspects of this are so interesting. With that algorithm, when those numbers are being generated, how are they testing them? I don't know, right? Like, are they actually putting them into the portal? I can't believe that. There must be some sort of lockout. If you try to get into my phone, my daughter did that and bricked up my iPad for a day, right? You know, I imagine the banks have the
tried that as well.
right. They have the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, how are they able to generate these numbers? And that's another question. I have to believe there have to be, mechanisms in place that would prevent these types of brute force attacks. But I've talked to many cybersecurity experts about this over the last few days. Some of them who perform some of these tests that you're talking about on behalf of these organizations. They will attempt to hack into them. And to a person, they say there are holes. And these are people who are not just, in business of selling their services to these organizations. Some of the people that I've spoken with actually work within these organizations and speak to me off the record and, in situations where it's like they're always going, technology is changing.
Always going to be flawed.
Technology is changing, things are moving. If you want the convenience of being able to cash a check on your phone, if you want the convenience of being able to bank anywhere, then technology is moving, and every time technology moves, that opens up the opportunity for another hole or another vulnerability. So it's a question of leapfrogging and staying on top of it, right?
It is, and we all have to remember that this is about ones and zeros. These are software programs that are often layered on top of each other, and you've got old systems trying to match with new systems, and there are software is inherently filled with errors and bugs, and you try your best to stay on top of it and fix it. And you have an obligation with this sensitive information to do that on a regular basis. There are going to be holes, and we just, again, it's trying to prevent people from accessing it through the holes, and then how do you respond if they do?
Exactly. All right, well, I think we're going to leave it there. Paige Beckman, thank you very much. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
And thank you, everybody, for watching. I'm Aaron Saltzman. This is CBC News. And come back again and watch us on our next Facebook Live.